the idea that it takes courage to do these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I mean, he said this too, that sorry, when he looks at our culture and our society, we don't have a lot of courage. We're sort of going along with things to a certain extent. Now, he said it more eloquently than that, but the idea that to be truly free and to be free to say those things that have that edge to them, like you're talking about, takes a certain amount of courage going against the grain, and then there are consequences for that as it goes.
Yeah, well, one of the things that both Joe Rogan and Dr. West were talking about, I think, went to this notion of freedom. And when we are truly free, sometimes it's scary, or maybe always it's scary, because suddenly, if you are free, then there is no one to blame for what happens next. We tend to, a lot of times as human beings, I think, maybe look for reasons why things don't go as well as we may have originally planned them. Mm-hmm. And if you're in a situation where the accountability rests with you yourself, which ultimately it does.
Yes.
In most cases. If you're in that situation, then I guess the burden you carry in that is that if things aren't going the way you plan, then do you recalibrate, or B, do you adjust, do you adapt, and that kind of thing.
Right.
At the same time, I think there was a discussion that maybe there's a lack of courage that in the species, I think is the way
Right, I think
Dr. West said it, a lack of courage in the species. And I think to some extent, you can see why that would be true. I mean, oftentimes the courageous are the ones who stick their necks out,
go against the grain.
Yes,
that's right.
But there are several things can happen. It's almost here's I guess a good business analogy.
Okay.
Let's say you're courageous, and so you go out and you borrow a lot of capital to establish a business.
Yeah.
And then the business doesn't go well, and you end up bankrupt, and you lose your home, that kind of thing. Well, I think in a lot of cases, folks would rather not take that risk, because it's easier to go to work for someone, which is what I did most of my life, go to work for someone. Then you have someone, you have rules, you have boundaries, you have these things, and the expectation on your part is that if you follow these rules, stay within these boundaries, you have superiors who you listen to. If you follow all that, then you're going to be okay. And
right.
In fact,
I mean, that's almost the promise of that, and that's a tradition that has kind of passed on, and we bought into it to a certain extent.
Well, I was going to say it's a total mindset, and there's absolutely no reality to it. I mean, it's real in the sense that as long as things are going good for whomever you work for, that maybe things will go well. But just a few things go differently in an organization or in an economy, and suddenly you're just as out to the woods as you would be if you were a business person and you were reporting to yourself. And,
and there's that structure, and I think he used that word as well too, that sometimes we sort of rely upon that structure to get us through, but if the person truly becomes free and says what going against the grain, as we just mentioned, that it's going against that structure as well. So even the ideologies behind those structures, it's going to take that courageous person to make that difference for people, I
think. No. So you go to your racist uncle's house, and he starts saying crap. Your capacity to be able to monitor your own experience and such that you can take that breath, it gives you the possibility of being able to lean in. So there is impact, the breath, and then leaning in. And you train that with therapists as well. And to be able to also give yourself, there are moments when you don't do that. You fall prey to the events that hit you. But,
we have to be aware of so that we're not losing every time we see someone else doing something more fun.
This could be the mental health takeaway from this. This could be if we need to have a bit of self-help for this.
Yeah.
To think about this is that if we think about those two levels of anxiety, in some ways, they really coincide. What may be happening when I'm sitting there at the pool is our nervous systems attempt to be able to generate what's called the euthymic window, and we try to be able to maintain a certain level of balance where you're not feeling too much or too little. And so you're trying, based on your genetic loading and your developmental history, our euthymic windows can be both, in context, they can be broader or narrow. So folks who are, quote, happy may have a broader euthymic window.
Okay.
But even as I'm sitting there by the pool, I'm having to navigate and mediate hunger, the need for elimination, all sorts of biological processes that directly and indirectly affect my psyche. And so we are always attempting to be able to maintain our equilibrium within that euthymic window. So even as I'm sitting there, the reason I picked the phone up may have been an attempt at some sort of balancing.
Okay.
Right? So the goal would be is how do we, and this is maybe something we can talk about in depth at another place, because something that really interests me, the difference between emotional regulation and emotional modulation.
Okay.
Emotional regulation, heroin, cutting, restricting food intake, those are all forms of emotional regulation. They regulate emotion. A healthy response is modulation. So what if, while I'm sitting there at the pool, I attempt to regulate by grabbing my phone and going on Facebook? I'm distracting myself from both my internal and my external surround in such a way that I'm not necessarily directly dealing with the things that I could deal with in the most healthy way. A modulation, as opposed to a regulatory activity, could be to simply take a breath and start to name and allow myself to experience in the moment the things that are going on, to listen to the sound of the pool, think about the sun as it hits me, to be able to look at my house and my pool, think about where I've been, where I'm at, where I'm going. Those are moments of meeting with the here and now. It's a meeting with the now that you can find only in an act of modulation, and they're often missing in an act of regulation.
From the studios of Columbus Media Group, you're watching Columbus Television.
Trauma is something that arrives before you have a chance to create it. In a way, that is exactly what happens. I think Facebook affords a certain trauma. And there is, in that's where there's a sort of a second term here. And it's one that I'm beginning to hear more of. And that is not FOMO, but JOMO.
JOMO. Okay, I was just getting the first one down. So
Okay, well,
what is this?
If FOMO is the fear of missing out, JOMO is the joy of missing out.
Oh,
So there is a
okay.
recoil.
Something's been turned here. We're getting
I think we're now beginning to sense that there is, you can see often memes of folks Netflix and chill, for instance.
Yes.
These are all an ode to being able to step away from the flow of social media and this interconnectedness, and it's a form of recoil, I think.
So that's an interesting thing, that we wanted to be connected, we wanted to be involved. Everybody wants all this information. We want to be on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and those social media platforms. But now that we're there, wait a second, what's happened to make people kind of pull back from this? Because I find that sort of a natural reaction to it.
Well, I've been listening to this guy, he's dead. There's a philosopher named Friedrich Hegel. You know?
Yes.
And he invented Pop-Tarts? No, he didn't.
No, that's it. The other Hegel.
Nothing to do, it was nothing to do with Pop-Tarts. But he talks about how that there is a dialectic, and there is a movement, and there's a movement of the spirit of the age, and that each age has its own distinct spirit. And so the zeitgeist, as it were.
Right.
And if our current zeitgeist is sort of defined by this interconnectedness, then we'll see it move, and there'll be this dialectic. There'll be a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis as there's some sort of movement of information, and that the possibility of a mind that could grow. When I think of, there's this concept of digital natives, for instance. Like my
Right.
son is a digital native. Like I can literally tell him stories that, we played outside because we didn't have a computer.
Right.
And he's like, what sort of weird place did you come from? Where's the?
How did that? Wait, you played outside? Oh
like,
yeah.
hey.
See, and the thing about it wasn't the toys you get; it was the boxes. It was those big boxes that you played in back in the day with the guy.
Yeah,
That
that's
took up
right,
all our
it's
time,
not,
But yeah, so it's re-education. It's bringing back history for.
To him, it's
trying
like,
to figure it
but
out.
he is a digital native, so the mind that is required for the new age doesn't require a Gutenberg mind, which is what you and I have.
Okay.
We grew up in a land of books. Information was shared. You shared another mind by someone writing something down and handing it to you, or something. Certainly we had media, we had TV, and all that sort of stuff. But still, it was the zeitgeist was the Gutenberg mind. But now we live in a world of the interconnected, the digital mind. It's a different thing.
Yeah, it's so fast. Everything happens so fast. So if there's a trauma somewhere, it's everywhere now. So you begin to pick up on it, had an effect on you as an individual. On the other hand, it's sort of good and bad news. We have this ability to connect with people, to build crowds, build audience. If you've got something really positive to say, then more people can hear it, and almost at a moment's notice too. So.
Yeah, I find that I can share nude pictures with people far easier than I could before. I mean, it's just not,
Yeah, if you haven't learned that lesson, we'll have that on another show because somebody needs to kind of control what happes to,
Actually,
with that camera.
whenever I send nudes, somebody always replies, "You should see a doctor about that." That's
Right.
really all I ever get. That looks infected. That's really that's all I ever get.
Okay. All right, but so it's having an effect on it. And no, so are you saying the JOMO is pulling back from it? So I want my personal space. Does that mean we cut off the social media? We close the phone down? We go off of social media?
Well, I think if the battle cry of JOMO is Netflix and chill, in some way it may be simply a retreat into another form of media, or it could be a momentary retreat from said thing. I will say that there are all these folks who talk about, you'll see this with some mental health experts, this notion of taking a Facebook vacation, where
Right.
you literally sort of, unplug. I wonder if the folks who are doing that are those more with a Gutenberg mind.
Right.
If they're, whereas it's interesting because my son, for them, a big form of communication is not books but memes.
All right.
So whether it is Twitter or Snapchat or memes, you convey information in these bite-sized nuggets, usually laced with irony. In his case, irony and sarcasm.
Right.
And there's something interesting about that. Now, how that connects with JOMO, I'm not sure, but it could be a way to. Those of us who find ourselves lost to Facebook, maybe there's a natural break that comes with someone in his generation where they literally can save themselves by being pulled into and drowned in envy by just taking nothing serious. Maybe there's a price to pay for that too. I don't know.
Right.
The rest of the alien staff float around. Moscow and here picking out the dull speck ahead of the shuttle. He'd seen it so many times in certain spectrums that he knew the watchtowers in the exact position against the unfamiliar constellations. His lips sucked down some air. The bag of orange juice was empty. He reached out to push it into the mouth of the refuse beside the washroom. Stopped in mid-movement. Frowned. Stared at the image of the second chance. Freeze image, he told his earbud. Call it haunted. it so many times and suddenly spectated, you knew the watchtower was in exact position against the unfamiliar constellations. His lips sucked down some air. The bag of orange juice was empty. He reached out